The Battle of Dak To, the brutal struggle in the Vietnam Highlands. In the dense, unforgiving jungles of Vietnam, where visibility was reduced to mere yards and the air was thick with humidity, a brutal confrontation was about to unfold. It was June 1967, and the paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade were deep in the Central Highlands, hunting for the enemy. Suddenly, the eerie silence of the jungle was shattered, gunfire erupted, and a relentless wave of North Vietnamese Army, NVA soldiers came crashing down on them. What followed was one of the most grueling and bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War, the Battle of Dak To. This was no ordinary fight. It was a test of endurance, courage, and sheer will to survive. American troops faced ambushes, relentless assaults, and brutal hand-to-hand combat, all while navigating impossible terrain. For weeks, they fought under constant fire, pushing their limits in a desperate struggle to hold their ground. Before we dive into this gripping story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment. What do you think was the most intense battle of the Vietnam War? Let us know below. Now, let's step into the chaos of Dak To. The strategic importance of Dak To. In early 1967, the Central Highlands of Vietnam became a critical battleground. The U.S. Military Assistance Command received intelligence that the North Vietnamese Army (NVA) was building up forces in the region. Their goal was clear: cut off enemy supply routes and stop NVA troops from entering South Vietnam from Cambodia and Laos. At the same time, the NVA had a plan of their own. Instead of fighting large American units head-on, they wanted to surround and destroy smaller U.S. forces. They set deadly traps, prepared strong defensive positions, and waited for the right moment to strike. The region's thick jungle and steep hills gave the NVA an advantage. They knew the terrain, while U.S. soldiers struggled in the extreme conditions. To stop the growing NVA threat, the U.S. sent in the 4th Infantry Division and the 173rd Airborne Brigade, a group of highly trained paratroopers. But instead of waiting for the enemy to attack, U.S. commanders chose a different approach. Major General William R. Pierce ordered a series of search and destroy missions designed to hunt down enemy forces before they could strike first. This decision led to Operation Francis Marion in April 1967, where U.S. forces clashed with NVA troops in small but fierce battles. These skirmishes became more frequent, and by June, the U.S. realized the NVA was sending even more troops to the area. The stage was set for a full-scale battle. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was about to face one of its toughest challenges yet. The early clashes. April, June 1967. By April 1967, the U.S. Army had begun Operation Francis Marion, a mission to disrupt the NVA's growing presence in the Central Highlands. American commanders believed they could control the area by launching search and destroy missions, but the terrain and weather worked against them. The thick jungle, steep hills, and heavy rainfall made movement slow and exhausting. Soldiers carried up to 100 pounds of gear, including weapons, ammunition, and supplies, earning them the nickname Elephant Soldiers. The first battles begin. At first, U.S. troops encountered small groups of NVA soldiers, but by late April, they faced much larger, well-organized enemy forces. One of the first major engagements happened near Dak To, where American infantry units fought an intense battle against an NVA battalion. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but it was clear that the enemy was growing stronger in the region. As weeks passed, skirmishes increased. More U.S. troops were deployed, including paratroopers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade. By June, the situation had become critical. The NVA was launching larger and more aggressive attacks. The Battle of the Slopes. A devastating defeat. On June 22, 1967, the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, was sent to patrol Hill 1338, a high point that offered a strategic view of the surrounding jungle. Alpha Company led the way, moving carefully through the dense foliage. Visibility was almost zero, and the thick fog made it impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. Suddenly, The jungle erupted with gunfire. Hundreds of NVA soldiers ambushed the paratroopers from multiple directions. The attack was swift and brutal. Wave after wave of enemy troops charged at the Americans, forcing them into hand-to-hand combat. Soldiers fought using bayonets, rifle butts, and even their fists to hold their ground. Despite their bravery, Alpha Company was overwhelmed. One by one, soldiers were shot down. Many called for artillery and air support, but bad weather prevented reinforcements from arriving in time. The fight lasted for hours, but by the end of the day, more than half of Alpha Company was dead. The few survivors escaped through the jungle, carrying their wounded as best they could. The aftermath. A wake-up call. The Battle of the Slopes was a disaster for the U.S. Army. 76 American soldiers were killed, making it one of the worst single battle losses of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Survivors described the horror of seeing their friends slaughtered, bodies left behind, and the enemy showing no mercy. The battle shocked U.S. commanders. They now understood that the NVA was much stronger and more organized than expected. American forces had underestimated their enemy, and the fight for Dak To was far from over. In response, the U.S. sent more troops and supplies to the region. The 1st and 3rd Brigades of the 1st Air Cavalry Division and the elite South Vietnamese Airborne Task Force were brought in to strengthen defenses. By the end of the summer, the number of U.S. troops in Dak To had doubled. Despite these reinforcements, the NVA was not finished. They had a much bigger plan in mind, and the worst was yet to come. The Battle of Dak To was about to reach a whole new level of brutality. The calm before the storm. July, October, 1967. After the Battle of the Slopes, the U.S. Army knew that the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was planning something big. The heavy losses in June proved that the enemy was not only well organized, but also determined to push U.S. forces out of the Central Highlands. However, by late summer, NVA attacks suddenly decreased. The jungle became quiet, and U.S. troops found fewer enemy soldiers in the area. At first, American commanders thought they had won. Perhaps the NVA had suffered too many casualties and retreated. But in reality, the enemy was preparing for something much bigger. The NVA's secret plan. While the Americans were reinforcing their positions, the NVA was regrouping and bringing in thousands of fresh troops. By October 1967, they had deployed over 6,000 soldiers, including 3 full regiments, 24th, 32nd, and 66th, and another in reserve, 174th. They were supported by the 40th Artillery Regiment, which meant they had more firepower than before. The NVA's goal was not just to fight American troops, they wanted to trick them. Their real strategy was to draw as many U.S. forces as possible into the Central Highlands. If enough American troops were tied up in Dak To, they would be too weak to defend major cities during the Tet Offensive, a massive attack planned for January 1968. To prepare for battle, the NVA built miles of tunnels, trenches, and bunkers. Some of these defenses took over 6 months to construct, making them incredibly strong. The Americans had no idea how well prepared their enemy was. Operation MacArthur. October-November 1967. By October 1967, U.S. commanders knew that the NVA was not finished in Dak To. Intelligence reports showed that large enemy forces were still hiding in the jungle, waiting for the right time to strike. To take control of the region, the U.S. launched Operation MacArthur on October 12, 1967. The goal was simple: find and destroy the enemy before they could launch a full-scale attack. The operation involved the 4th Infantry Division and the 173rd Airborne Brigade, along with South Vietnamese forces. The battle was about to escalate, and the paratroopers of the 173rd would soon face their toughest fight yet. The battle for Hill 823. A deadly trap. As part of Operation MacArthur, the 173rd Airborne Brigade was sent on search-and-destroy missions near Hills 823 and 875, located close to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a major supply route for the NVA. On November 4, 1967, Bravo Company, 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment was ordered to clear Hill 823 of enemy forces. The soldiers advanced carefully, knowing the NVA was likely hiding in the dense jungle. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by machine gun fire and mortar explosions. The NVA had been waiting. They were dug in with fortified bunkers and hidden trenches. The paratroopers were caught in a deadly ambush. For hours, the battle raged on. The NVA's position was nearly impossible to attack as their trenches were interconnected by tunnels, allowing them to reinforce their positions quickly. Every time a bunker was cleared, a new enemy crew would take over. Realizing they could not break through on their own, the paratroopers called for artillery support. Using beehive rounds, shells filled with thousands of steel darts, the artillery created gaps in the NVA defenses. This allowed the paratroopers to push forward and finally take the hill. But the victory came at a high cost. Many American soldiers were killed or wounded, and the survivors knew that this was just the beginning of the real battle. The pursuit of the enemy. A costly mistake. After capturing Hill 823, U.S. commanders believed that the NVA was retreating. They ordered Task Force Black and Task Force Blue, made up of units from the 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, to chase after the enemy and destroy them before they could regroup. On November 10, 1967, Task Force Black followed an NVA communication wire left behind in the jungle. They assumed it would lead them to a retreating enemy force. Instead, it led them straight into an ambush. The 8th and 9th Battalions of the NVA 66th Regiment were waiting. The moment the paratroopers entered the area, they were hit with heavy machine gun fire and RPGs. Task Force Black was completely surrounded. Captain Thomas M. Way, the unit's commander, called for reinforcements, but the thick jungle delayed their arrival. The soldiers had no choice but to fight for their lives. One of the heroes that day was Private First Class John Barnes. When an NVA grenade landed near a group of wounded soldiers, he threw himself onto the grenade, absorbing the explosion to save his fellow paratroopers. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. It took an entire day for reinforcements to arrive. When Task Force Blue finally made it through the jungle, the combined forces were able to push back the NVA and escape the deadly trap. But the battle had been devastating. The 173rd Airborne had suffered heavy losses, and morale was beginning to drop. The soldiers knew that something even worse was coming, the final showdown at Hill 875. The battle intensifies. Dak To, Airfield under siege. By November 12, 1967, as U.S. forces struggled through the dense jungles and brutal ambushes of Dak To, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, launched a direct assault on the Dak To airfield. This was no random attack. The NVA had been preparing for months, and their goal was to cripple U.S. air operations in the region. The NVA strikes first. Under the cover of darkness, NVA artillery and mortar teams unleashed a massive bombardment on the Dak To airfield. Hundreds of shells rained down, destroying ammunition depots, fuel supplies, and aircraft. The attack lasted for 3 straight days, making it nearly impossible for helicopters to resupply U.S. troops in the field. The most devastating moment came when a mortar round hit a storage area full of C4 explosives. The explosion was so powerful that it could be felt a mile away. Some reports suggest it was one of the largest explosions of the entire Vietnam War. During the siege, the NVA destroyed 2 C-130 Hercules transport planes, cutting off vital supply lines. The attack caused over 1,100 tons of munitions and fuel to go up in flames, making it one of the most successful enemy assaults on an American base in the war. Despite the chaos, U.S. troops held their ground. They used bunker positions and counter-artillery fire to slow down the enemy, preventing them from advancing further into the base. But the damage had already been done. The paratroopers in the jungle were now dangerously low on supplies. Securing the high ground, Hill 1338 and Hill 882. Realizing that the NVA was using the surrounding hills to launch their attacks, U.S. commanders ordered their troops to take back the high ground. One of the first targets was Hill 1338, which overlooked the Dak To Valley. The fighting lasted for 2 days, with U.S. troops facing heavy resistance as they climbed the hill. When they finally reached the top, they discovered an intricate system of tunnels and bunkers, showing just how well prepared the NVA had been. Meanwhile, 6 miles to the west, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, was sent to clear Hill 882. On November 16th, they engaged what seemed to be a small group of NVA soldiers. But as soon as they fired, a massive enemy force hidden in trenches returned fire with AK-47s and grenades. The paratroopers immediately called in airstrikes and artillery fire, but the thick jungle made it difficult to target the enemy. Bombs and napalm fell, but many enemy positions remained untouched. The battle continued for 2 days, with NVA forces launching wave after wave of counterattacks. At one point, the paratroopers had to protect a group of war correspondents who were dangerously trapped in the middle of the firefight. Interestingly, the reporters were given priority for evacuation, even before some seriously wounded soldiers. By November 19th, after days of intense combat, U.S. troops finally secured Hill 882. But they had suffered heavy casualties, and the battle was far from over. Because just a few miles away, a bloodbath was about to unfold on the deadliest battleground of the entire campaign, Hill 875. The bloodbath on Hill 875, November 18 to 23, 1967. By mid-November 1967, after weeks of brutal jungle warfare, the battle was about to reach its deadliest phase. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had suffered losses, but they were far from defeated. They had prepared their final stand on Hill 875, a steep, heavily fortified position that overlooked the entire Dak To region. Taking the hill would be the key to securing the area, but it would cost American soldiers more than they ever expected. The first assault, a deadly mistake. On November 18, 1967, a small U.S. Special Forces unit was sent to scout Hill 875. What they found was terrifying. An entire NVA regiment, the 174th, was dug into deep, well-constructed bunkers. The NVA's position was nearly impenetrable, with 3 layers of trenches, tunnels, and machine gun nests. Realizing they were outnumbered, the Special Forces team pulled back and called for reinforcements. The 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, was ordered to attack the hill and clear out the enemy. However, due to heavy casualties in previous battles, the battalion was under strength, with only 290 troops instead of the expected 450. Still, they prepared for battle. That night, U.S. artillery and airstrikes pounded the hill, preparing the way for the main attack the next morning. November 19th. The trap is set. At 9 a.m. on November 19th, Delta Company led the assault, with Charlie Company on the right flank and Alpha Company in reserve. The paratroopers climbed up the ridge, moving through a mess of fallen trees and shattered terrain caused by the previous night's bombing runs. Then, the first soldier in Delta Company climbed over a fallen tree limb and was instantly shot dead. The jungle erupted with gunfire. NVA troops were hiding everywhere, waiting for the Americans to enter their kill zone. Machine guns, mortars, and RPGs rained down on the soldiers. Within minutes, Delta and Charlie companies were pinned down, unable to move. At 1 p.m., the paratroopers launched a second attack, trying to break through the enemy line. First Sergeant Leonard Duran of Delta Company managed to throw a grenade into a bunker, killing its crew, but the NVA's tunnel system allowed new soldiers to replace them immediately. Things went from bad to worse when U.S. artillery mistakenly fired on friendly troops, killing and wounding several Americans. With casualties rising, Captain Eugene Kiley of Alpha Company ordered a retreat down the hill. At the same time, a small 4-man observation team was ambushed. One of the soldiers, Specialist 4 Carlos Lozada, saw the NVA moving in to encircle the entire company. Knowing that if he stopped firing, his entire unit would be wiped out, he refused to retreat. Lozada kept his machine gun firing until he was mortally wounded. His bravery allowed his comrades to escape, and he was later posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But Lozada's sacrifice wasn't enough to stop the NVA. By the afternoon of November 19th, Alpha Company was overrun and Captain Kiley was killed. The 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment was now completely surrounded. Ammunition was running low, and rescue helicopters couldn't reach them because of the heavy enemy fire. November 20th. Holding out for survival. As night fell on November 20th, the paratroopers dug into defensive positions, fighting to survive. With no fresh supplies, many wounded soldiers had to bandage themselves using strips of cloth from the dead. At dawn, the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment was sent to relieve the survivors, but the journey through the jungle was slow and dangerous. By 5:30 p.m., Bravo Company finally reached the base of Hill 875, linking up with the trapped paratroopers. Major William Kelly, the executive officer of the 2nd Battalion, was flown in by helicopter to take command. With supplies still low and enemy forces everywhere, Kelly knew that if they didn't take the hill soon, they would all die there. November 21st to 22nd. The final assault. On November 21st, U.S. forces launched a third major attack on Hill 875. This time, they used everything they had: artillery, airstrikes, and a full battalion assault. But the NVA was still there, waiting for them. As the paratroopers advanced, they were met with relentless enemy fire. They reached the first line of enemy trenches, but were too exhausted to push forward further. The battle had now dragged on for 4 days, and both sides had suffered enormous casualties. By November 22nd, the smell of death and burnt trees filled the air. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was running out of men, and there were no fresh reinforcements available. Many paratroopers were too weak to fight, surviving on only a few sips of water per day. Then, on November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day, the final push began. The 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment attacked from one side, while the 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment climbed from the other. The NVA fired back, but their numbers had dwindled. The Americans finally reached the top of Hill 875 at 11:22 a.m. When they got there, the NVA was gone. The North Vietnamese had escaped through their tunnels, abandoning their fortified position after nearly a week of brutal combat. The battle was finally over, but the price was unimaginable. The cost of victory. When the 173rd Airborne Brigade was pulled back to Dak To, only 130 men remained uninjured. The final death toll for the Battle of Hill 875 was 361 Americans killed, 15 missing, and 1,441 wounded. Over 1,000 NVA soldiers were killed, but the battle had drained American morale. The soldiers were exhausted, battered, and scarred from the nightmare they had endured. To make matters worse, General William Westmoreland, the U.S. commander in Vietnam, downplayed the losses, calling the battle a major victory. In reality, American forces had been nearly wiped out, and the NVA had succeeded in distracting the U.S. before the Tet Offensive. For the paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne, the battle would never be forgotten. They had fought with everything they had, but many never made it home. The aftermath and legacy. The Battle of Dak To was finally over, but the cost had been devastating. The 173rd Airborne Brigade had fought bravely, but they had suffered one of the highest casualty rates of the Vietnam War. Many survivors were scarred, physically and mentally, after enduring weeks of brutal jungle warfare. The true cost of the battle. In total, 361 American soldiers were killed, 15 were missing, and 1,441 were wounded. The NVA suffered over 1,000 casualties, but despite their losses, they had achieved their goal. The battle had successfully distracted U.S. forces from the upcoming Tet Offensive in January 1968. Even worse, 40 U.S. helicopters were shot down during the 3 weeks of fighting, limiting the ability to resupply soldiers and evacuate the wounded. Survivors described horrific conditions, with bodies left in the jungle and soldiers having to bandage themselves with scraps from the dead. For many Vietnam veterans, Dak To was a battle they never forgot. The nightmare of Hill 875 haunted them, and the sense of being abandoned in the jungle, outnumbered and outgunned, remained with them for the rest of their lives. Was Dak To a victory? Officially, U.S. commanders claimed victory. General William Westmoreland, the highest-ranking U.S. officer in Vietnam, stated that the enemy had been defeated. He insisted that at no point were U.S. troops trapped or in danger of being wiped out. But the soldiers on the ground knew the truth. Many believed that Westmoreland's statement was a lie, covering up the fact that they had been lured into a battle they were never meant to win. The NVA had drawn American forces into the jungle, weakened them, and then vanished into the mountains, only to return stronger for the Tet Offensive just 2 months later. The legacy of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Despite the heavy losses, the paratroopers of the 173rd Airborne continued fighting in Vietnam. They had earned a reputation for bravery and resilience, proving themselves in one of the most brutal battles of the war. 2 soldiers, Private First Class John Barnes and Specialist 4 Carlos Lozada, were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for their incredible acts of heroism. Their stories remain a testament to the courage and sacrifice of American soldiers in Vietnam. 9. Conclusion. The Battle of Dak To was one of the most brutal and costly engagements of the Vietnam War. The 173rd Airborne Brigade fought with unmatched bravery, facing overwhelming odds in the dense jungles and steep hills of the Central Highlands. Though the U.S. claimed victory, the battle had weakened American forces just months before the Tet Offensive, a turning point in the war. To all the soldiers who fought and sacrificed in Dak To, your bravery will never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible war history. See you in the next one.